night this Saturday. No signs of survivors in a China Airlines crash off the coast of Taiwan. New terror warnings from the federal government, nuclear plants, small planes, jet skis, and scuba divers. Why state officials are taking little action. Kidnapped, missing, and still on the ballot, the story of an unlikely presidential candidate. And new life for an old memorial, remembering the Great War.
From ABC News World Headquarters in New York, this is World News Tonight, Saturday.
Good evening, I'm Elizabeth Vargas. Search and rescue vessels are combing the sea off Taiwan tonight for victims of a devastating plane crash. The China Airlines Boeing 747 vanished from radar screens 20 minutes into its flight. It was traveling from Taipei to Hong Kong. 225 passengers and crew were on board. ABC's Josh Gerstein has the latest from Hong Kong.
At Taipei's International Airport, scenes of grief as word spread that China Airlines Flight 611 crashed shortly after takeoff. The weather had been clear and the pilot sent no distress signal. Search boats found an oil slick, life vest, and an airplane door about 20 miles off the Taiwan coast. Some debris was also found on land about 50 miles from the crash site, suggesting the plane disintegrated at a high altitude.
We know that there's a wreckage distribution over a wide area here. That suggests a catastrophic in-flight breakup. And we know that there are a number of potential causes to that, not the least of which are an internal explosion, either from an internal cause like a fuel tank, as in TWA 800, or a bomb.
Today, an official with the airline said the plane underwent a major overhaul last year. He also offered condolences to the families and apologized for the crash. China Airlines, a Taiwan-based carrier, has one of the world's worst safety records in recent years. In 1993, a China Airlines 747 skidded off the runway into Hong Kong Harbor. In 1994, another flight crash-landed in Japan, killing 264 on board. And in 1998, a China Airlines Airbus crashed in Taipei, killing more than 200.
One of the questions here is whether or not China Air, in this particular instance, has done everything in accordance with what we would want to see done in terms of service bulletins and airworthiness directives, which are not mandatory outside the United States.
The accident comes as the nerves of air travelers in this region are already on edge. This is the third crash of a large jetliner here in Asia in the last 6 weeks. As relatives wait for answers about the latest tragedy, officials from Boeing and the National Transportation Safety Board are en route to the crash site to assist in the investigation. Josh Gerstein, ABC News, Hong Kong.
A tense military standoff between Pakistan and India worsened today. At its center is the disputed region of Kashmir. Today, Pakistan test-fired a medium-range missile capable of carrying nuclear weapons. ABC's Jim Shudo has more now from the India-Pakistan border.
Ending a week of threats and counter-threats, Pakistan test-fired a series of missiles today capable of carrying nuclear or conventional warheads deep into India. It was Pakistan's first missile test since 1999. We don't want war, said Pakistan President Pervez Musharraf, but we are ready for it. Indian Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee said, "We do not take these tests seriously," and claimed they were intended to strengthen Musharraf's position at home. Still, the test drew criticism from President Bush and Russian President Vladimir Putin in St. Petersburg today. And Secretary of State Colin Powell, traveling with Mr. Bush, said the administration was disappointed with Pakistan's actions.
I don't think it was a particularly useful thing to do right now, even though I don't think it causes us to get any closer to a conflict.
At issue is the status of Kashmir, which is claimed by both countries. Tensions flared last week after an attack at an army camp in Indian-controlled Kashmir killed 34 people. India blamed Islamic militants based in Pakistan. Pakistan is under pressure from India and the West to control those militants who are supported by many Pakistanis. Meanwhile, the two nuclear powers have 1 million troops massed along their border. India and Pakistan have exchanged artillery fire here along the border on and off since December and non-stop over the last 7 days, killing several civilians on both sides of the border and forcing thousands to evacuate. With tensions still high, the stream of refugees out of the border area is growing. And Pakistan says it will continue the missile tests for 3 more days. Jim Shudo, ABC News, on the India-Pakistan border.
The president's trip to St. Petersburg tops the other news in tonight's overseas brief. It was a day of diplomacy and culture for the U.S. and Russian presidents. President Bush told students at St. Petersburg State University today their country has, quote, a bright future. Presidents Bush and Putin and their wives took in the Hermitage Art Museum and the Russian Ballet. Mr. Bush heads to Paris tomorrow and Normandy on Memorial Day. A collision between a passenger train and a freight train is being called the worst rail disaster in Mozambique's history. About 200 people are dead, 400 are injured. A transport minister says human error caused the crash. Israeli tanks and troops swept back into Bethlehem today, just 2 weeks after the long siege ended at the Church of the Nativity. Witnesses report hearing shots and explosions as Israeli troops searched for militants close to Manger Square. This Memorial Day weekend follows a series of warnings about possible terrorist attacks by air, land, and sea. All of the alerts have been short on specifics. Responding to such vague warnings is posing a major challenge. ABC's Derek McGinty has more.
Take off your jackets, take off your belts, and take off your watches.
The sights and sounds of summer's unofficial first weekend. Holiday sightseers navigated new rounds of stepped-up security following a week of vague warnings from the government about potential terrorist attacks. Threats to nuclear plants, subway systems, and national monuments from enemies in anything from small planes to scuba suits. Today, at the Statue of Liberty, a new device to match every face against a data bank of known terrorists.
This is instantaneously. I just walked through, I did not stop, and it captured my image.
Tourists were wary but unintimidated.
I'm not afraid. I think that I have faith in what New York's doing and the precautions they're taking for this weekend.
We just got back from Afghanistan, so this doesn't bother us at all.
Even New York's governor made a personal appearance at the Statue of Liberty to inspire confidence.
Here today on this beautiful day, people are still coming to New York City, to the Statue of Liberty from around our country and around our world because they appreciate that this is a secure, safe, and free city.
Despite the stepped-up security here in New York, officials in many other states say they cannot do any more to respond to the government's series of general warnings. The reason? Too many threats, not enough specific information.
It's counterproductive to put out all these threats. It stretches our local law enforcement resources thinly, and over the long run, the public will become cynical when none of these threats develop into a concrete action.
Unless we have a specific type of threat, then we are satisfied that our comprehensive security plan is adequate to meet most of those types of things.
Security officials argue they're trying to strike a difficult balance between safety and freedom, and these tourists are hoping they've got it right. Derek McGinty, ABC News, New York.
When we return on World News Tonight this Saturday, still missing, still on the ballot, the mystery of Ingrid Betancourt. Lessons learned, one Catholic community's sex abuse crisis long ago. And renewed life for a salute to old soldiers. Tomorrow, security will be tight when Colombia holds its presidential election. The candidate expected to win, Álvaro Uribe, has promised to crack down on leftist guerrillas. They have long terrorized civilians and politicians in that country. Among their victims, Ingrid Betancourt, also a candidate in tomorrow's election, who was kidnapped. More now from ABC's Jeffrey Kaufman in Bogota.
These are the last pictures of Ingrid Betancourt, a presidential candidate campaigning in southern Colombia, where guerrillas, not the government, control the land. Despite being warned, she defiantly said she would drive on. What if the guerrillas come out? A reporter asked her. We are in God's hands, answered Betancourt. Hours later, she was kidnapped. That was 3 months ago. Betancourt has not been seen since. Her captors are a powerful rebel group who control much of this country's cocaine industry. For almost 40 years, they have terrorized its citizens with kidnappings and killings. Betancourt is one of at least 67 politicians being held hostage by the guerrillas. The only word of her fate came from a guerrilla leader shortly after her kidnapping. He said she would be held for a year.
They're interested in her as a bargaining chip. First, to humiliate the government, which I guess one could say they have achieved, but also to use her in any future negotiations with the government.
Tomorrow, Colombians choose a new president. Betancourt's name is still on the ballot. Her husband has defiantly refused to close down her campaign.
And we don't know anything yet. No news. We don't know if she is still alive. So it's devastating for me.
Betancourt is 40 years old, a mother of two, and the product of a privileged upbringing in Bogota and in Paris. As a Congress member, she reveled in her role as a maverick, handing out Viagra to voters with a pledge to reinvigorate this country's tainted democracy. These doors are closed to the corrupt, she chanted on the steps of Congress. In Colombia, acts like these are both brave and naive. Threats on her life forced her to send her children out of the country. In the final paragraph of her book, published just before her kidnapping, Betancourt wrote, "Will they kill me, too?"
Ingrid says all the time to their children, in life there are things more important than death.
Even before her kidnapping, Betancourt had little chance of winning tomorrow's vote. For her, this race was about democratic principles. In this country, they come at a high price. Jeffrey Kaufman, ABC News, Bogota, Colombia.
Still ahead, a military man's solution to the Catholic Church's sex abuse crisis. In Boston today, Cardinal Bernard Law inducted 5 men into the priesthood. Law has been under intense fire for protecting priests accused of sexual abuse. Law told the new priest today that at this critical time, the church needs holy men. The current wave of sex abuse scandals recalls a period 10 years ago in New Mexico. Then the Archdiocese of Santa Fe faced its own public scandal and almost went under after paying hefty settlements to victims. Part of the problem, troubled priests from around the country were sent to a treatment center there and then later assigned to local parishes. The Archdiocese weathered that storm, but not without scars. Other voices tonight from Santa Fe.
What a beautiful day, isn't it? And we have 6 of the most beautiful children in the world here to receive their first Holy Communion. I was ordained in 1991, and at about that time we were beginning to hear stories about Father so-and-so and about Father so-and-so and about Father so-and-so.
And then all of a sudden there was a flood of claims, one right after the other. By 1992, 1993, in the early 90s, there were as many as 20 pedophile priests who had been accused of preying on children in the state.
Part of the problem that was unique to New Mexico was that we had a treatment program. Priests who'd abused children were sent to the servants of the Paraclete. Unfortunately, after their treatment, they were, in many cases, released into dioceses in New Mexico.
And then the Archbishop himself was accused of improper activity. Not pedophilia, but he was accused of improper sexual contact with women. The Archbishop himself was forced to resign. But the church finally woke up. And it was in about 1993 when Archbishop Sheehan came in and priests were removed, one right after the other.
The Holy Father sent me here to take over the Archdiocese in a very, very troubled time. We had about 187 lawsuits and claims that had to be dealt with. And I believe the figure for settling those cases was something like $25 million. We were on the edge of bankruptcy.
The new Archbishop Michael Sheehan asked me to be his vocation director, to recruit and to screen and to train men for priesthood, men that would never hurt a child. You know, I think part of being an infantry officer, you have to learn, you're taught to take the measure of a man. I think I can take the measure of a man. I'd say for every 3 candidates that I speak with, 2 don't get out of the first interview. My job includes being a bit of a detective, kind of searching for information that they would not be willing to give me. We know, a lot of times, many of the perpetrators, I mean, when I met them, I knew they were flaky. I said, my goodness, what is this guy's problem? And the people in the pews would say, my, where did this guy come from? So it's not, I don't think it's that complicated.
Now we realize a zero tolerance policy is really the only way that we can go.
And it worked here in New Mexico. It worked. We haven't done stories in years on priests accused of molesting children. We don't do that anymore here in New Mexico because it doesn't come up anymore.
As a result of our efforts, God's grace has helped us so that now we have, I think, a church that's very alive. The Archdiocese is flourishing, really, in so many ways, perhaps more than before.
The Santa Fe Archdiocese is now out of debt. There are 20,000 new families registered in the church, and 20 candidates are studying to be priests there. But not everyone has healed.
My case was the first case that was filed in Albuquerque, New Mexico. When I was a youngster, age 15, the parish priest began molesting me, basically.
Our sons were 9 and a half and 11 when the molestation began in our home. But the settlements for my sons to make new lives and pay their own counseling bills were pathetic.
So when Sheehan says it's cleaned up, please, been there, done that, and moved on. I don't believe it for a minute.
I will never be active in the Roman Catholic Church again because you have to have respect and trust for any organization you function in. I have no respect and no trust.
No, I'm not sanguine that our problems are solved here in Santa Fe. I think we've come a long way, but I think this is an ongoing thing, and I think we have to be eternally vigilant when our children are at stake.
When we hear about what's going on in other parts of the country, Boston, for example, today, the first thing that comes to my mind is, this is deja vu. Where was everybody 10 years ago? Why weren't they listening to what was going on in New Mexico?
What planet were they on? You know, when we were here suffering and dealing with the truth, finally. The masses ended, go in peace. I mean, we knew, you know, and we didn't have within ourselves the courage to look ourselves in the face and say, you know, we need to clean this up. And that won't happen again. Not in Santa Fe. And I pray to God in no other diocese either.
You got the duty, huh?
Father John Carney and other voices in Santa Fe, New Mexico. When we come back, the rebirth of a towering World War I memorial. Finally tonight on this Memorial Day weekend, a look back to the First World War, known as the Great War. ABC's Barbara Pinto explains how a fading memorial has been reborn.
With military pageantry and great fanfare, Kansas City rededicated its towering memorial to lives lost in the First World War.
You know, people are soon forgotten.
At 106 years old, Navy veteran Paul Sunderland is one of a dwindling brotherhood who remember firsthand the so-called Great War.
I marvel that I got through it and got to go home because we were in dangerous places many times.
Cities across America lost 116,000 sons and daughters in World War I. But here in Kansas City, they felt a special bond.
Almost all troop trains, moving troops to and from the war, came through the Kansas City area. And so these people, these men and women who were involved in the war, became part of the community of Kansas City as well.
Just 2 weeks after the armistice in 1918, Kansas City raised more than $2 million to build a memorial. In 1926, when the monument opened, 150,000 people came. Grace Hales, then a teenager, wanted to see the general who led the American troops.
Well, it was a big deal for the city, of course. I enjoyed seeing Pershing, General Pershing.
But by the 1990s, the 217-foot memorial was a crumbling relic, unsafe after years of neglect and decay.
People almost had turned their back on it for a while, and then it came to the point where it just plain had to be closed.
Again, city residents came through, approving a tax hike that raised $40 million to restore the Liberty Memorial and honor men like Paul Sunderland. It's a way of guaranteeing that when veterans can no longer speak of this war, the stones will tell their stories. Barbara Pinto, ABC News in Kansas City, Missouri.
And that is our report. You can email us at weekend@abcnews.com. We do like hearing from you. I'm Elizabeth Vargas. For all of us here at ABC News, have a great weekend and good night.